They said the church freezer was for communion bread and bottled water. But when a 15-year-old boy pried it open, he found his grandmother's body locked in frost. Hours earlier, his parents had preached about family, loyalty, and faith. What no one knew was that inside their home they kept secrets sharp enough to slice through generations. He didn't call the police. He snapped a photo, posted it online, and asked the world, "Does anyone know what this looks like?" On the surface, the Hatcher household was everything people expected it to be. Eric Hatcher, a pastor in his late 30s, stood at the pulpit every week with the same calm voice his congregation trusted. His wife, Keisha, carried herself with poise, sitting neatly in the front row with their two sons, Terrell, 15, and Mark, 8. To the church community, they looked like a family that had weathered life's challenges and come out stronger. But beneath that veneer was a home layered with silences, small fractures, and secrets that would one day explode. Eric's role as pastor was more than a calling. It was his identity. His father had once held that same role, a man respected for his steadiness, a man who spent more time at home than in the world. Eric had been his shadow, drawn to his father's presence, clinging to the stability he offered. In contrast, his relationship with his mother, Brenda, was distant. Brenda had been active and sharp, but her energy rarely centered on Eric. She was never cruel, just detached, a woman who stood apart rather than leaning in. That dynamic followed them into adulthood. They weren't enemies, but they were never close either. When Eric's father passed away, Brenda's world shifted. With her health beginning to fail and her independence slipping, she moved into Eric and Keisha's home. For Eric, the arrangement felt like an obligation. He owed her care even if he never felt the warmth of her affection. For Keisha, it was an adjustment she accepted reluctantly. She ran the household with order, and now another presence, sharp-tongued, opinionated, and unfiltered, was suddenly part of their daily rhythm. For Terrell and Marquis, it was just Grandma, another adult voice in a house already full of rules. At first, it seemed manageable. Brenda was polite to church members when they visited, blending seamlessly into the family's public image. She attended services, sat quietly in the pew, and played the role of supportive matriarch. But inside the home, the air carried a different weight. Brenda often reminded Eric of his father, drawing comparisons that cut more than they comforted. She was quick to notice when Keisha's tone sounded off, or when the boys weren't disciplined as she believed they should be. The criticisms weren't constant, but when they came, they hung in the air long after the words left her lips. For Eric, those moments stirred the old distance he had felt as a boy. For Keisha, they chipped at her sense of authority inside her own home. And for Terrell, listening from the edges of conversations, they formed a picture of adults who were more divided than they let on. The Hatcher family's cracks did not begin with Brenda moving in. They had been there from the very first years of Eric and Keisha's marriage, hidden beneath layers of silence. Behind the wedding smiles and the celebrated union was a secret Eric revealed only after vows had already bound them together. He was impotent. The confession didn't come in public or even in the early stages of courtship. It arrived only after the marriage was sealed, when Keisha, now a young bride, asked why attempts at intimacy had produced no signs of life. Eric, cornered, told her the truth he had carried in shame for years: he would never be able to father a child. For Keisha, who had built her future around the vision of a family, the revelation was crushing. But divorce, especially for a pastor's wife, was unthinkable. It would stain not only Eric but also her. And so, they decided to create a solution that would preserve the marriage on the surface, even as it corroded the trust underneath. The first arrangement came quietly. Curtis Cole, Eric's assistant pastor, was a man in his early 30s who had long admired Eric. He owed his position and his opportunities in ministry to him. When Eric approached him privately, explaining the sacred need for the family to continue. Curtis was stunned. He resisted at first, unwilling to cross such a line. But Eric's pressure was relentless, framed as duty, as loyalty, even as sacrifice for the greater good of the church. Eventually, Curtis gave in. The arrangement was cloaked in secrecy, a quiet betrayal rationalized as service. From that union came Terrell, born into the world as Eric and Keisha's son. To the congregation, he was a miracle baby, proof that God had blessed their union. To Curtis, he was a living reminder of guilt he couldn't fully name aloud. Years later, the need arose again. Keisha wanted another child, and Eric, still bound by his condition, could not provide it. This time, they turned closer to home. Tony Hatcher, Eric's younger brother. Unlike Curtis, Tony didn't carry the same burden of church loyalty. He agreed, though not without a certain pride in knowing that part of him would live under his brother's roof. The arrangement was made in whispers, carried out in shadows, and sealed with silence. From that came Marquis, the second boy raised as Eric's son. To the outside world, both children belonged to Eric and Keisha. The truth was folded into the walls of their home, never acknowledged beyond the three adults who had taken part in it. Curtis distanced himself as much as possible, throwing himself into church work while avoiding moments that would remind him of the child he had fathered. Tony, however, lingered with a restless attachment. He would visit often, spending time with Marquis under the guise of being the fun uncle. His connection was obvious in the small ways he favored the boy, ways that Keisha noticed and Eric resented. Inside the family, the secret worked like a quiet toxin. Eric wore the mask of fatherhood but knew his bloodline was absent in both children. He compensated with authority, reminding them of discipline and control, but he never carried the ease of a man secure in his legacy. Keisha, for all her role as a mother, lived with the memory of the compromises she had made. She wanted children, and she had them, but the price was a household built on agreements that could never be spoken aloud. Tony Hatcher had played the role of uncle for years, but his bond with Marquis went deeper than shared bloodlines. For Tony, Marquis wasn't just a nephew, he was his son. The resemblance wasn't lost on him. The boy's expressions, the way he laughed, even the stubborn streak he carried seemed like reflections of Tony himself. At first, he was content with the charade, slipping into the house with gifts, joking with Marquis in the yard, and savoring the moments in which the boy unknowingly reached for him with the trust children often reserve for their fathers. But as Marquis grew older, Tony's restlessness grew with him. He wanted more than scattered visits and playful afternoons under the guise of family. He wanted acknowledgement, something closer to the relationship he felt entitled to. The arrangement that once seemed manageable now felt like theft. The son he had fathered was being raised under another man's name, hidden beneath lies that served everyone but him. Tony began pressing harder. What started as casual requests, "Let me take Marquis for the weekend," or "Why don't I bring him to my place for the holidays?" slowly hardened into demands. Keisha was the first to push back. She knew the danger in letting Marquis spend too much time with Tony, fearing the boy might pick up on a truth that could unravel everything. Eric agreed, though his reasoning was tinged with pride as much as caution. The idea of his younger brother forming a stronger bond with the boy than he had himself stoked an anger he rarely admitted. The refusals stacked up. Each time Tony asked, the answer was the same. Marquis was too young, too busy, too needed at home. The excuses sounded polite, but Tony heard the wall behind them. His role as father was being erased, written out of his own bloodline, and he couldn't stand it. By 2010, the tension was no longer subtle. Family gatherings turned sharp. Tony's eyes lingered on Marquis in ways that unsettled Eric. Conversations between the brothers, once filled with casual joking, became clipped and cold. Keisha, who had once seen Tony as the solution to her desperate longing for a second child, now viewed him as a threat to the carefully balanced secret she had built her life upon. Tony's frustration began to spill over. One evening, after another denial, he snapped. He told Keisha directly that if they continued to keep Marquis from him, he would make sure the truth came out. The words were said in anger, but they weren't idle. He carried the power to collapse the family's entire image with a single confession. Eric confronted him afterward, hoping to calm the storm. But instead of finding compromise, the conversation erupted into a shouting match. Tony accused Eric of cowardice, of living a lie, of clinging to a title he hadn't earned. Eric, in return, warned Tony that speaking out would ruin them all, not just him. The argument ended without resolution, leaving only the echo of threats neither man could ignore. For Curtis Cole, the assistant pastor who carried his own silent guilt as Terrell's biological father, the tension between Eric and Tony was a grim reminder of how fragile their arrangements truly were. Curtis had withdrawn into silence, choosing distance over confrontation, but Tony refused to retreat. His presence was loud, insistent, demanding recognition. Marquis, still too young to understand, felt only the confusion of being tugged between adults who seemed to carry more interest in him than he could explain. He enjoyed the attention, but the invisible tug-of-war over his identity was already shaping the storm that would eventually explode. The Hatcher's household carried the weight of Tony's demands like a ticking clock. Each denial drove him closer to the edge, each refusal sharpened his anger. Eric and Keisha thought they could manage it, that Tony would eventually relent. But the truth was, Tony had already decided. If they wouldn't give him his son willingly, he would expose the secret himself. And the person he would turn to would be the one person neither Eric nor Keisha expected, their own mother, Brenda. The phone call came late, unexpected, and charged with the kind of anger only a brother can carry. Tony Hatcher had reached the breaking point. Denied again from spending time with Marquis, he dialed his mother, Brenda, and let the truth he had carried for years erupt without restraint. "Marquis is mine," he told her flatly. "Your son has been raising my child as his own. They've lied to you, to the church, to everyone." Brenda, already accustomed to Tony's hot temper, at first thought it was exaggeration. But the details spilled out faster than she could dismiss them. The arrangement with Keisha, the secrecy, the refusals that had pushed him to the edge. Each word pierced her with a mixture of disbelief and clarity. As the fragments assembled, the weight of the truth crushed her. Her grandson was not her grandson in the way she had always believed. For Brenda, the revelation was more than betrayal, it was desecration. The church her husband had built, the family she had trusted to carry the legacy, the respectability she had fought to maintain, all of it now lay poisoned under a web of deceit. She had always known Eric and Keisha's marriage carried its strains, but never could she have imagined the depths of compromise hidden behind their walls. The next evening, Brenda confronted them. The air in the living room was tense as she stood before Eric and Keisha, her voice trembling not from weakness but from fury. She demanded answers, and though they tried to deflect, she pressed harder, repeating Tony's words back to them with an accuracy that stripped away any room for denial. Eric's face hardened. Keisha, usually composed, faltered. The silence between them was confirmation enough. For Brenda, the betrayal was total. She pointed to the walls around them, the pulpit Eric stood behind each Sunday, the children who bore the burden of secrets they had never chosen. She called it filth, sin, a disgrace that mocked everything her husband had built before his death. Her fury built into a vow. By morning, she said, she would take the matter before the church elders. The congregation would hear the truth from her, not whispers, not rumor, but from the mouth of the matriarch herself. Eric and Keisha, she declared, had one night to prepare themselves for the consequences. That vow landed like a hammer. For Eric, it was the threat that could end not only his position but his very identity. For Keisha, it was the collapse of the fragile arrangement she had maintained at unimaginable cost. Neither of them spoke after Brenda left the room. They didn't argue, didn't raise their voices. They sat in silence, each knowing the weight of what had just been promised. In the hours that followed, their conversations turned hushed and sharp. Keisha pressed the point first. Brenda could not be allowed to stand before the elders. Eric resisted, torn between the voice of a son and the instincts of a man cornered. But as the night deepened, resistance gave way to fear. Every detail Brenda had threatened to reveal was true, and once spoken, there would be no repair. By dawn, their fear had twisted into resolve. Brenda, the mother who had raised Eric, the grandmother who had lived under their roof, had become the single greatest threat to their survival. In the logic of desperation, she was no longer family. She was exposure. She was ruin. The house was quiet as Brenda prepared for bed, unaware of the decision already forming in the minds of her son and his wife. She believed she had until morning to act, but she had only hours. The vow she made that night did not bring redemption. It signed her death warrant. When the house was still, Eric retrieved a heavy pillow from their bed. Keisha followed him to Brenda's room, her face drawn but resolved. They opened the door slowly. Brenda stirred slightly in her sleep but did not wake fully. In those moments, Eric hesitated, the weight of blood relation pressing against the act he was about to commit. Keisha urged him forward with a nod. Together, they moved to the bedside. Eric pressed the pillow over his mother's face, leaning with his full weight while Keisha held Brenda's arms down against the bed. The struggle was short, muffled, and soon ended in silence. When it was over, Brenda lay still, her body slack against the mattress. The air in the room felt heavier than before, but neither Eric nor Keisha spoke. The deed was done. They worked quickly to erase signs of the act. Keisha stripped the bedding and bundled it for washing, while Eric wiped down the surfaces Brenda had touched earlier in the evening. They checked the hallway for stray marks, listened for movement from their son's rooms, and returned to ensure her body looked undisturbed. But leaving her in the house was impossible. Morning would bring discovery. The only solution they saw lay in the church. It was the one place they controlled completely, the one space where questions would not easily be asked. Together, they wrapped Brenda's body in a heavy blanket and placed it into the trunk of Eric's car. The short drive to the church was silent, every turn of the tires louder in their minds than any sermon they had ever preached. At the church, they unlocked the back entrance and carried the body inside. The freezer, normally used for food supplies, stood at the rear of the storage area. Eric opened it, and together they lifted Brenda into the cold space. Her body folded unnaturally against the metal walls, but the lid closed firmly. For Eric and Keisha, the freezer became more than storage. It became concealment, a barrier between their crime and the world outside. They lingered only long enough to be sure no trace remained. The blanket was burned later in a barrel behind the church, the ashes scattered into the night air. Back at the house, Keisha returned to laundering sheets and scrubbing floors while Eric sat in silence, staring at the wall, the pillow still discarded in their bedroom. By dawn, the home appeared untouched, the bed where Brenda had slept freshly made, as though she had simply risen early and left. When Terrell and Marquis awoke that morning, nothing seemed amiss. Their parents moved through routines with the same rigid order, hiding exhaustion behind practiced calm. Brenda's absence was explained simply: she had gone to visit a friend, or she was resting elsewhere. No questions lingered long. The boys accepted what they were told. But the reality was locked in the church freezer, hidden under layers of frost. For Eric and Keisha, it was not only their mother and mother-in-law lying there, It was the truth itself, frozen and concealed, the secret they hoped would never be opened. In the days after Brenda's death, the Hatcher household adjusted to a new script. The room where she once slept was tidied, her personal belongings quietly packed away or pushed into storage. Eric and Keisha rehearsed explanations before offering them. Brenda had gone to visit relatives out of town. She was spending more time with friends from her former congregation. She was resting in a different part of the community. The story shifted slightly depending on who asked, but always carried the same tone of casual dismissal. Within the church, the absence raised eyebrows at first, but not alarms. Members assumed Brenda was ill or traveling. When Eric, from the pulpit, mentioned her taking time to rest, the matter was considered settled. Congregations rarely pressed their pastors for personal details, and in the rhythm of services and programs, her absence faded into the background. Few thought it unusual that a grieving widow might distance herself from the daily grind of church life. Behind closed doors, however, the secret demanded constant vigilance. Eric and Keisha moved through their routines with an edge of tension that was invisible to outsiders but palpable within their walls. The church freezer, once used for storing food for events and supplies for outreach, was now the unspoken vault of their crime. Every time Eric unlocked the church, every time Keisha stepped into the fellowship hall, the thought pressed against them, Brenda was still there. The freezer itself became a symbol of weight. It hummed steadily in the storage room, just another appliance to everyone else, but to Eric and Keisha it carried the silence of a grave. Neither spoke about it directly, but the knowledge bound them together in secrecy. When they passed one another in the house at night, when they led services shoulder to shoulder, the thought lingered like a shadow. Terrell and Marquis noticed changes, even if they couldn't name them. Terrell, sharp and observant, picked up on the stiffness in his parents' tone when the subject of his grandmother arose. He heard the way they dismissed questions too quickly, how they avoided the specifics of where she had gone. Marquis, younger and more trusting, accepted the answers at face value, but even he sensed the unease in the air. Brenda had been a regular voice in the household, quick to comment and quicker to criticize. Her sudden silence felt unnatural. Curtis Cole, the assistant pastor, kept his distance. He accepted the official explanations like everyone else, but inside he carried his own suspicions. He knew the Hatcher household better than most, and he recognized the signs of strain when Eric spoke. Still, his own guilt over fathering Terrell kept him silent. Curtis was not in a position to question anything too closely without risking exposure himself. Tony, on the other hand, refused to let the matter go. He noticed his mother's absence most of all, and when calls to her phone went unanswered, he began pressing Eric for details. The answers he received were vague, offered without the conviction of truth. Though he could not prove anything, his instincts told him something was wrong. His anger deepened, but for the moment he held back, waiting for a chance to force the issue again. Meanwhile, Eric and Keisha doubled down on appearances. They led services, visited members in need, and hosted gatherings as though nothing in their world had shifted. They smiled at the right times, prayed with conviction, and shook hands at the door. To anyone looking in from the outside, they seemed untouched by scandal or sorrow. Their secret, for the moment, was safe. But the weight of it was beginning to move beyond silence. For weeks, the word lingered only in whispers. The freezer. Eric and Keisha never spoke of it openly, but in late-night arguments, when their guard slipped, Terrell heard it drift through the walls of his bedroom. He wasn't supposed to be listening, but at 15, he was already accustomed to catching fragments of adult conversations that told more than the polished answers he received in daylight. One night, the whisper became a heated exchange, sharp enough to carry down the hallway. Terrell lay still, ears straining as his parents' voices clashed over what would happen if the freezer was ever discovered. The word embedded itself in his mind. Why a freezer? Why so much fear in a word that, in his world, should have meant nothing more than ice and food? Terrell couldn't let it go. In the days that followed, he noticed how his parents avoided each other when the subject hovered close. He noticed how his father's study, usually accessible, was suddenly locked more often than not. Curiosity hardened into suspicion. One Saturday afternoon, while his parents were distracted with church meetings, Terrell slipped into the study. The key had been left inside Eric's jacket pocket, carelessly hung over the back of a chair. Terrell had watched enough times to know that his father kept the church keys in a small metal ring tucked away in the top drawer. His hands trembled as he retrieved them, slipping them into his pocket before quietly shutting the drawer. That evening, when the house grew silent, Terrell acted. He waited until his parents had gone to bed, then crept out with the keys in his pocket. The church stood only a short walk away, familiar to him in every corner, yet strange in the darkness of night. He let himself in through the back door, the click of the lock sounding louder than he expected. His footsteps echoed faintly as he moved down the hallway toward the storage area. The freezer stood against the wall, its metal surface reflecting the dim light that seeped in from a high window. Terrell hesitated, every instinct warning him to stop. But the word, the freezer, pushed him forward. He inserted the key, turned it, and lifted the lid. The blast of cold air hit him first, a sharp breath that stung his skin. Then his eyes adjusted. Inside, wrapped but unmistakable, was the pale face of his grandmother, Brenda. Her skin, rigid with frost, bore the unmistakable stillness of death. Her body was folded awkwardly to fit the space, her features locked in silence. For a moment, Terrell froze as completely as the body before him. His grandmother had been gone for weeks, explained away with vague excuses, but here she was, hidden in the one place his parents controlled most. The truth struck him harder than any sermon he had ever heard. His parents hadn't just lied, they had killed. Shock gave way to a desperate need to prove what he was seeing. His phone shook in his hand as he pulled it from his pocket, the glow of the screen faint in the dim storage room. He raised it, steadied himself, and snapped a photo. The click sounded louder than the church bells on Sunday morning, but the image captured what words could not. He lowered the lid slowly, heart pounding, and stepped back into the night air. The keys jingled faintly as he returned them to the study before slipping back into bed. Sleep didn't come. Instead, the image of his grandmother's frozen body burned on his phone screen, the weight of a secret no 15-year-old should ever have to carry. By morning, his parents moved through the house as though nothing had changed. But Terrell knew differently. The photo in his possession was more than proof. It was a weapon, a question, and a truth waiting to be revealed. For days, Terrell carried the photo like a stone in his pocket, too heavy to ignore, too dangerous to share. At 15, he didn't have the language to explain what he had seen, nor the courage to confront his parents directly. Each time he looked at his mother and father, the weight grew sharper. They prayed over dinner, smiled at church members, and carried on with the same controlled precision, but Terrell could not unsee the truth. His grandmother was lying frozen in the church freezer. He scrolled through the photo again and again, staring at the pale skin, the rigid features. The image refused to fade from his mind. The pressure became unbearable. Finally, late one night in his room, he did what many teenagers in his position might do. He turned to the internet. Without context, without explanation, he uploaded the image to his social media account and added a single line of text. "Does anyone know what this looks like?" It was not a confession. It was not even a clear statement of fact. It was a question, a way of throwing the weight out into the world to see if someone else could help him carry it. The responses were immediate. At first, friends reacted with confusion. Some assumed it was a prank, an edited image meant to shock. Others stared longer, unsettled by the realism of the frozen face. Comments poured in. Is this real? Bro, that looks like a body. Where did you even get this? The ambiguity only fueled attention. Within hours, the post had spread beyond Terrell's circle. Strangers began resharing it, speculating on its origins. Some thought it was a horror stunt. Others insisted it looked like evidence of something darker. The comment threads grew longer, each reply layering more curiosity and suspicion. Somewhere in that expanding network of eyes, one viewer decided the risk was too high to ignore. The image was flagged and forwarded to authorities, accompanied by a short message. This looks like a dead body. Please investigate. When police received the tip, they treated it seriously. The photo, though grainy, bore details too specific to dismiss. The rigid facial features, the frost crystals clinging to skin, it did not resemble a staged image. Tracing the post back to its source led them directly to Terrell's account. By the following day, officers arrived at the Hatcher residence. Inside the house, Eric and Keisha were unprepared. They had lived for weeks under the assumption that their secret was safe, that their control over appearances was enough. When investigators knocked on their door, their carefully maintained composure faltered. Questions about Brenda's whereabouts quickly collapsed under the weight of the photograph. Terrell, confronted, admitted the post was his. He explained that he had taken the picture in the church storage room, that the body was his grandmother's. The officers listened, their skepticism fading as the boy described the key, the freezer, the unmistakable sight of what he had found. By evening, a search warrant was issued for the church. Officers moved through the quiet building with measured steps, guided by the directions Terrell had given. When they reached the back storage room, the freezer stood exactly where he had said it would. The lock clicked open, the lid lifted, and the silence inside the church broke under the gasp of discovery. Once the freezer was opened, there was no room left for speculation. The pale, rigid body of Brenda Hatcher lay inside, exactly as Terrell had described. Officers secured the church immediately, sealing off entrances as crime scene technicians moved in with cameras and evidence bags. Word spread quickly through the small community, though details remained tightly controlled. What mattered most in that moment was that the body was real, the photograph authentic, and the story Terrell had posted online was no longer a cryptic curiosity but a homicide investigation. The first step was the boy himself. Terrell was escorted from the scene and questioned separately. At 15, he was nervous but cooperative. He explained how he had overheard his parents whispering about the freezer, how he had stolen the keys from his father's study, and how he had discovered his grandmother's body. His account was consistent, and when investigators compared his story with the photograph and the evidence inside the freezer, it lined up. Terrell was not treated as a suspect, but as the unwitting witness who had opened the door to a family's darkest secret. Attention turned immediately to Eric and Keisha. Officers brought them in for questioning that same night. The couple arrived with a facade of composure, but cracks began showing as soon as the questions started. Asked when they had last seen Brenda, Eric claimed she had left weeks earlier to visit friends. Keisha echoed the same story, though her tone lacked conviction. When pressed for specific names or locations, both faltered. Investigators noted the hesitations, the inconsistent details. The discovery of the body made their denials hollow. Forensics confirmed that Brenda had not been moved recently, she had been in the freezer for weeks. The timeline pointed squarely to the night she was last seen in the Hatcher home. As the hours wore on, interrogators split Eric and Keisha into separate rooms. In isolation, each tried to shield the other, but the inconsistencies multiplied. Eric insisted Brenda had left on her own. Keisha claimed she had helped pack her bags. Yet no bags were ever found, no evidence of travel, No calls made from Brenda's phone after the night she threatened to expose them. Faced with the mounting evidence, Eric's demeanor shifted from defensive to silent. He avoided eye contact, his answers shortening into clipped denials. Keisha, under pressure, grew more emotional. She broke first, not with a full confession, but with cracks in the story. She admitted that Brenda had threatened to expose private matters, that there had been conflict in the house, that the situation had grown out of hand. From there, investigators pieced together the motive. Terrell's testimony about overhearing arguments, Tony's angry phone call about Marquis' parentage, and Keisha's partial admissions all converged into a narrative. Brenda had discovered the truth about the boy's paternity and had threatened to reveal it to the church elders. Hours later, she was dead. Forensics corroborated the account. The condition of the body, the fibers collected from the bedding, and the absence of signs of forced entry pointed to an inside job. The evidence suggested smothering, a quiet act carried out in the middle of the night, followed by the careful concealment of her body. By dawn, Eric and Keisha were no longer free to return home. Both were formally arrested on suspicion of murder, conspiracy, and abuse of a corpse. Their carefully crafted image as a model pastoral family collapsed in a matter of hours. The same congregation that once looked to them for guidance now watched in shock as news cameras recorded their transfer in handcuffs. The Hatcher story had begun to unravel, not through whispers or rumors, but through the cold step-by-step work of investigators who followed a teenager's cryptic post to the truth hidden in plain sight. What lay ahead was no longer speculation. It was the slow march of justice through courts, confessions, and verdicts. The morning after Brenda's body was found in the church freezer, Eric and Keisha Hatcher were formally charged and booked into custody. The images of the once respected pastor and his wife in orange jumpsuits marked the collapse of the facade they had maintained for years. The community saw only the arrests, but behind closed doors, investigators pressed for the full story. During interrogation, Eric initially refused to speak. He leaned on silence, his eyes fixed on the table as detectives laid out the evidence. Brenda's body, the bedding fibers, Terrell's testimony, and the timeline of her last night alive. Keisha, seated in a separate room, broke first. Under steady questioning, she admitted there had been a confrontation with Brenda the night she died. She claimed Brenda had threatened to ruin everything by exposing the truth about Marquis. The admission shifted the investigation from speculation to certainty. Step by step, the rest of the story began to unfold. Detectives learned that Eric had confessed his impotence to Keisha early in their marriage, and that they had arranged for other men to father their children. At first, investigators thought Keisha might be exaggerating to shift blame, but when names surfaced, Curtis Cole and Anthony "Tony" Hatcher, the pieces locked into place. Curtis, the assistant pastor, was questioned days later. He looked exhausted, his face drawn as though years of guilt had finally caught up with him. At first, he denied involvement, but confronted with Keisha's statements, he admitted to fathering Terrell under Eric's arrangement. He described how Eric had framed it as an act of loyalty, a duty to preserve the image of a fruitful marriage. Curtis had agreed reluctantly, ashamed of the role he played. He insisted, however, that he had no part in Brenda's death. His guilt was tied to the past, not the murder. Tony's interrogation was far less restrained. Furious at being dragged into the case, he nevertheless confirmed that Marquis was his son. He described how Eric and Keisha had repeatedly refused him access, how his frustration boiled over into the phone call to Brenda. His anger was undeniable, but like Curtis, his role ended at fatherhood. He denied knowledge of the killing until after the fact, and investigators found no evidence tying him directly to the night of the crime. For detectives, the narrative was now clear. Eric and Keisha, desperate to protect their image and prevent Brenda from exposing the truth, had acted together to silence her. Curtis and Tony were not suspects in the murder itself, but their involvement in the paternity arrangements deepened the scandal. The entire Hatcher family structure, once admired as upright, now lay in ruins. The confessions were pieced together not as dramatic breakdowns, but as weary acknowledgments of a web too tangled to deny. Eric eventually admitted to smothering his mother while Keisha restrained her. He explained it not as rage, but as necessity, a cold calculation to protect the family's name. Keisha echoed the same reasoning, her words framed as survival rather than choice. Both described the freezer as a desperate solution, a place they believed no one would ever look. The revelations sent ripples through the community. Church members who had once praised Eric as a moral leader now wrestled with the reality that their pastor had killed his own mother. The assistant pastor they trusted had fathered a child with the First Lady. The pastor's brother, known to many as a friendly presence, had fathered the other. Every layer of trust had been broken. By the end of the week, Eric and Keisha faced charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and abuse of a corpse. Curtis and Tony were not charged with homicide but were subpoenaed as key witnesses. Their reputations were shattered, their names permanently tied to the scandal. Terrell, once just a teenager posting cryptic words online, was now the central witness whose actions had exposed a crime no one thought possible. The Hatchers' secrets were no longer whispers behind closed doors. They were confessions on record, testimony prepared for trial, and evidence ready for a jury. The family's collapse was complete, but the fight for judgment had only begun. The trial of Eric and Keisha Hatcher began just under a year after Brenda's body was pulled from the church freezer. By then, the scandal had fractured their congregation and turned the Hatchers' name into a byword for betrayal. The courtroom was filled with a mix of church members, family acquaintances, and reporters, all waiting to hear the full story laid out in public for the first time. From the start, the prosecution wasted no time cutting through appearances. In opening statements, they told the jury this was not only a case of murder but of deception stacked over years. They laid out the chain of events, Eric's impotence, the sanctioned affairs that produced Terrell and Marquis, the simmering conflict with Anthony, Tony, Hatcher, and the explosive revelation Brenda threatened to deliver. The prosecutors framed the killing as a calculated act, born not of impulse but of fear, a son and daughter-in-law eliminating the one person who could unravel their carefully crafted lives. The defense countered with a softer narrative. They admitted conflict existed, but argued Brenda's death had not been premeditated. They suggested the situation escalated in the heat of argument, that Eric and Keisha panicked and acted without clarity of mind. They pushed for manslaughter over murder, portraying the couple as overwhelmed by pressure rather than cold-blooded killers. But the evidence dismantled the defense's strategy piece by piece. The most devastating came from Terrell. On the witness stand, the 15-year-old recounted how he overheard whispers about the freezer, how he stole the keys, and how he discovered his grandmother's body. The jury was shown the photo he had posted online, a grainy but unmistakable image of Brenda's frozen face. Terrell's voice was steady, but the weight of his testimony filled the room. It was the voice of a child exposing his own parents, and it cut through any attempt at sympathy for Eric and Keisha. The prosecution built on Terrell's account with forensic testimony. Experts confirmed Brenda had been smothered, with no signs of forced entry or struggle outside her bedroom. Fibers collected from the bedding matched the pillow Eric admitted to using. The timeline of her death aligned with the night she threatened to go to the church elders. The freezer itself, presented through photographs, showed how her body had been folded and preserved. Each detail reinforced the prosecution's narrative of deliberate concealment. Witnesses followed in steady succession. Curtis Cole admitted under oath that he fathered Terrell at Eric's request, describing the pressure he felt to comply. His testimony added depth to the story of manipulation and secrecy. Tony Hatcher confirmed his role as Marquis's biological father and recounted the angry call to Brenda that triggered her confrontation with Eric and Keisha. Both men distanced themselves from the killing, but their admissions painted the Hatchers' marriage as a web of calculated compromises designed to protect Eric's image at all costs. When it came time for Eric and Keisha to testify, the defense attempted to frame them as desperate, not malicious. Eric described the decision as a tragic mistake, claiming he acted out of fear of losing everything he had built. Keisha wept as she insisted she never intended for Brenda to die, only that the situation spiraled. But under cross-examination, both were pressed with the same question: why the freezer? Why the lies that followed? Their answers, fragmented, hesitant, unconvincing, did little to sway the jury. Closing arguments crystallized the contrast. The prosecution called it a story of selfishness and betrayal, a family destroyed by its own lies, a mother killed by the very son she raised. The defense urged the jury to see the human side, to weigh years of pressure and shame. The jury deliberated less than 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was clear. Eric and Keisha Hatcher were found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and abuse of a corpse. The judge's words were final. Both would serve life sentences without the possibility of parole. The courtroom fell silent as the couple was led away. Terrell sat in the witness section, his face pale, knowing his testimony had sealed his parents' fate. Curtis and Tony left with their reputations in ruins, their names forever tied to the scandal, though not as killers. And the congregation, once devoted, now sat stunned at how far deception had carried the family they had trusted most. The guilty verdict marked the end of the trial, but it was only the beginning of the fallout. Eric and Keisha Hatcher were each sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the courtroom, they showed little reaction as the judgment was read. For years they had lived under the strain of secrets, but now the silence that followed was different, final, immovable. The couple who once stood in front of a congregation as leaders would now live out their days behind bars, stripped of the titles and respect they had clung to. Curtis Cole, once the trusted assistant pastor, never faced prison time, but he did not escape unscathed. His confession to fathering Terrell at Eric's request cost him his position and credibility. The congregation that had once looked to him for guidance could not separate his ministry from the scandal. Resignation followed swiftly, and Curtis withdrew from public life. For him, the judgment was not measured in years, but in the loss of every platform and relationship he had built. Anthony Tony Hatcher carried a different weight. His role as Marquis's biological father had been exposed in open court, and though he was not charged with a crime, the shame attached to his name was permanent. He had demanded acknowledgement of his son, and in the end he received it in the worst way possible, as part of testimony that tied him forever to the destruction of his family. His anger, once loud, turned into quiet bitterness. Neighbors whispered about his involvement, and relatives distanced themselves. He lived with the knowledge that the phone call he made to his mother had been the spark that set everything ablaze. For Terrell and Marquis, the aftermath was even heavier. Both boys were placed in protective custody with relatives outside the immediate family. At 15, Terrell had carried the unbearable task of exposing his parents, an act that freed the truth but destroyed his home. His testimony had made him both the key witness and the orphan of a family still alive. Marquis, younger and less able to understand, struggled to process why his parents were gone and why the uncle he adored was revealed as his true father. The boys entered adolescence under the shadow of a story that followed them wherever they went. The church community, once a tight circle built on faith and trust, never recovered fully. Congregants who had believed in Eric's leadership were left with a sense of betrayal that stretched beyond the crime itself. To them, the freezer was more than evidence. It was a symbol of how deception had been allowed to thrive within their walls. Attendance declined. Families left quietly. The name Hatcher became synonymous with scandal, and the pulpit that once carried authority now stood as a reminder of the collapse of integrity. In the years that followed, the case remained a reference point for betrayal at its most intimate. A mother killed by her son, a wife complicit, children conceived in secrecy, and a body hidden in the very place meant for trust and community. The details were repeated in hushed tones, not as gossip but as a warning that the gravest dangers often come not from outside enemies but from within the home. For Eric and Keisha, prison became the final stage of their partnership. For Curtis and Tony, life outside the courtroom became a quiet exile. For Terrell and Marquis, the years ahead were shaped by questions with no easy answers. And for the church, the betrayal left scars that time could not fully erase. The freezer had been opened, the truth exposed, and nothing in the Hatcher family's world would ever be the same again.